I'm going to show you how I take log footage or footage that looks like this and make it look a little more cinematic through color grading. Okay, let's just jump right in. To start with, you want to look at your footage. Hopefully you've got properly exposed footage. It has the kind of lighting, the creative vibe that you are already looking for, but there's still a lot of work to do in post, especially with this log footage. So you're going to want to first ask yourself this question: where are you? This subject is inside of a car. Is it daylight? Is it a night scene? And so on. And allow the exposure to go where it's going to go. For example, you're not going to take nighttime footage and try to boost up the gain so much to perfectly expose with the Ansel Adams zone system his skin tones, when really he should be sitting in the dark. So this is what we're focusing on this first node here. We want to create a proper exposure given the environment that our subject's in. So in this case, it's exposed pretty much properly, but not a lot of dimension to his face. It's almost like a broadcasty type look to it. We want more of a filmic look. So let's take the lift down to bring our shadows and details in here. I'm letting it crush. I'm going to pull back on that later, but I'm letting it crush. A little bit of gamma. And mid-tone will just probably pay attention to this area here, just to kind of kick it up that little bit. You don't want to overdo mid-tone. It can really blow out your highlights really quickly. They call it mid-tone under the log settings, but really it's more of a highlight feature. Your actual mid-tones in the skin and so on are really around the gamma range. Okay. So now we'll just add a little S-curve, which is typical of any kind of film type footage. And I do something just very slightly. It's more about just bringing the shadows, a bit of a curve down there, just slightly, and just compensating back for it with the highlights. Helps overall with the contrast. We're also going to use the contrast here. Two settings for contrast is the amount you're putting here, and also the pivot point. So the lower the number, the finer the detail it is that you're adding contrast to. A lot of times I'll do a dot 150, but on this type of footage, I'm already seeing a lot of fine detail there, so it's just an overall contrast that I want. So I'll put it back to something like that, and I'll just increase it to about 158. That's probably good. So that's it for the first node, but we're gonna probably come back and do little tweaks as we go ahead. So that's overall, it's just more about the exposure. Oh, and the saturation, because we've dropped down values, especially in the lift area, what that will do is automatically make the image look more saturated. When you boost up values like the gain and even the lift, if you push the values up, you're creating it a less of a saturated image, so then you would need to add saturation. In this case, we've added saturation by reducing these values. So let's just compensate by reducing the overall saturation. And that way his skin isn't glowing red, but still has some nice tone to it. Next node. I'll do it through the mouse here so you can see what I'm doing. Add serial node. And for this one, this is where we're just going to start playing with the colors. Now, if you had a color cast through this with your original footage, like you had a bit of a yellow tinge or green, or even a blue, because your white balance wasn't quite right, then you would change that overall in this first node. And probably the best place to do it, easiest place to do it, is in this offset wheel. So you can just, it kind of applies to everything. So, and it would be very slight. Normally the movements over here are like this, which is why the big color setups, they have the big panels with those balls on it that you can roll to just make the finest of adjustments. Because really, in a multi-node system like this, each fine adjustment just kind of adds up. And before you know it, by the time you're on the output of this, you have a huge change in your image, although you've only made very tiny little incremental moves. Okay, so back to the point. Lift. Let's this is really your shadow area for the most part, so we're just going to slightly pull that a little bit into the blues, and see, you notice that we start to lose the color in the skin tone, and that's what you expect. So you just compensate for it. The push-pull system, you go into your gamma and you just do the opposite movement about the same amount too. Like we brought this down, you know, this far, so on gamma we're going to push it up about the same distance in the exact opposite direction. And that way you've got in your blacks and so on, if you look closely, you'll see a slightly blue tinge, and the skin tones are still quite natural because we've pushed them back. In highlights, sometimes you just want to add it with that kind of a setup. And this is almost just a color corrected vibe. It's really not doing a crazy color grading, but most Hollywood films, you'll find that, I mean, other than a lot of the action films, you'll find that they play it pretty safe. Skin tones should look like skin, and black should look black, which we're going to get into a little trick to make sure your deep blacks are pure black. It's a very simple method that I have to do that. Okay, so I think that's about it for the initial color thing. Now what we're going to do is parallel nodes here, so that we're keying off of the same base image. Node, parallel, node. And another thing about the film look as opposed to a video look is your highlights. And this is really what color grading is all about, as far as the workflow goes, is what area are you paying attention to during, you know, the adjustments that you're doing. So first step, we were looking at the overall exposure, which was the overall where the blacks sit and where your midtones sit. We didn't do too much with the highlights. I mean, we're not going to be able to fix this blown out thing, and that's fine. It's supposed to look like that. The next phase, we changed, we just create a little bit of separation between your shadows and your midtones so that the image pops a little bit. And then on this, we're looking at the highlights. Now the highlights look decent. The issue is that if you look very closely, and you may not even be able to see it on YouTube, there's a bit of a, there's kind of an artifact. The way it transitions from what's not highlight into highlight, it's a little bit too crisp. And you don't want to lose the crispness of the image, but you want to dull that down a little bit. So the best way of doing that is to use a qualifier. So we're just going to select this area here where it's really hot, and we'll look at what the key is doing. And we don't care about the color, so the hue and saturation we won't bother with. But what we will do is just bring this low level down so we get a little bit of the specular highlights on his cheek, and really picking all this up. So I think that's pretty decent. Maybe a little less of that. And then blur radius, that'll just soften the key. So now that we've got what we want keyed, we'll just go over to the blur tab, and it's set to blur here. And we're going to increase the radius by about 55. We'll bring it up to about 55. And this is just how much detail, this HV ratio. So let's just bring this down a little bit. Yeah, it should be good. Now, you will not see this on YouTube at this point because the compression, but just pay attention to how this just slightly gets softened. And in fact, you don't even see it much on this image while it's still. It's more about when it's in motion that it has less of a video look to it. We're still not quite there yet. There's another couple things that we want to do. Let's add another parallel node. And in this parallel node, we're going to focus on something else, which is the color. Another problem with video is reds a lot of times and greens, they're way too saturated in conjunction with the rest of the whole image. So what you want to do is just reduce that to get closer to what film does, and they don't oversaturate those colors. Okay, so what we're going to do is somewhere around here, and something like this, and then I'm just going to bring this down. Notice what it does in the skin tone. Again, it's all about what you're paying attention to while you're doing this. So if you just notice the skin tone, which it can be deceiving because it looks nice to see nice flush red skin, but it kind of gives it away that it's real video. So you just take a little bit of that out, and the greens as well. So pay attention. I'll put it back. Look at the greens in the background up here and so on. And they're already a little desaturated. It wasn't too bad, but if you pull this out, look, they almost go to a black and white, but just look at how it brings the focus to our subject. You know, this is back up. That's what it looks like when we take it down. And there's all kinds of things. Like I'm also taking yellow down. I'm not concerned about that. If you wanted to keep a little bit of a yellow wash in your image, if you had that warm look overall, you could do two separate little pieces here and pull them down. So, and then for the big trick that I love, I'll go back to our first node because I think it should probably be there. And this is where you want your blacks. As you go deep down, and we're seeing a little bit of a blue tinge, and it's kind of there's color in your blacks, and you want that a little bit on the top end as your blacks go closer to grays. But as it goes to true black, you want that color removed because that's really what film does as well. So I found down here, if you go to luminance versus saturation, it's taking the darkest end of the image over here, and this is your lightest part of the image. And I just put a little marker here, and I'm going to pull this down. And if you look at our blacks, see, pull it back up, back down. It just takes a little bit of that over-saturated blacks and cleans up your blacks. And you can even extend this a little more if you really wanted to go crazy with it. But I mean, you still want color in it, but I'm going to leave it around here. And you do the same thing on the whites, but not as drastic because, you know, there's a lot of yellow that you still want little warm hues and so on. So I'll just probably do it around here and just dip it down here. So that means down here our white is pure white, and it slowly graduates up to whatever colors are in the image. Our blacks are pure black, and it's a nice curve up into the lighter grays where you start to see some tone and color. And overall, that should be our image. I'll make this full screen for a second. That's after. This is before. After. Okay. Hopefully you learned something in this video, and if you liked it, please give me a thumbs up and be sure to subscribe.